She kept saying she had to leave before sunrise, but the cowboy had already seen the bruises on her wrists. The barn doors slammed open as snow blew across the floorboards. Wade caught Norfa just before she collapsed beside the saddle rack, her fingers frozen around a torn leather satchel. Somewhere outside, a horse screamed into the storm. She tried to pull away from him anyway. "Don't let them find me here," she whispered. They noticed the bank seal burned into the papers, spilling from her bag. "If stories like this stay with your heart, come ride along for the next one." The stagecoach rolled into Silver Creek just before sundown, its wheels groaning against the frozen dirt road. Dust clung to the windows. One of the horses snorted steam into the cold October air as the driver pulled hard on the reins outside the small depot. Wade Harper stood near the hitching rail, with his gloves tucked into his coat pocket. Behind him, the mountains had already turned dark blue beneath the falling evening light. The smell of pine smoke drifted from somewhere across town. He checked his pocket watch again. 5 minutes late. Not unusual for a coach coming through mountain roads this time of year. Still, his stomach stayed tight. 4 months of letters sat folded in the drawer beside his bed, back at the ranch. Neat handwriting. Careful words. A woman from Philadelphia who sounded steady and practical. Someone who claimed she wanted quiet more than excitement. The coach door finally opened. An older couple climbed down first. Then a traveling salesman carrying 2 carpet bags. Wade glanced past them, waiting. Then he saw her. A woman stepped carefully onto the platform, wearing a dust-covered blue coat over a wrinkled cream dress. Her gloved hand trembled against the coach door. She nearly missed the last step. For one strange second, she just stood there. Her face was pale from travel. Blonde hair had slipped loose beneath her bonnet, and her eyes, red. Not from wind, from crying. Wade removed his hat slowly. "Miss Bell?" She looked toward him, as though she'd forgotten where she was. For a moment, he thought she might not answer at all. Then she nodded once. "Mr. Harper." Her voice sounded worn thin. The driver dropped a weathered suitcase beside her boots. Nora flinched at the sound hard enough for Wade to notice. Her fingers tightened around the handle immediately. "You all right, Mom?" the driver asked. "Yes," she answered too quickly. But she wasn't. Anyone with eyes could see that. A few people near the general store had already slowed to stare. Small towns always noticed newcomers, especially women arriving alone. Wade stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We can get out of the cold first." Nora swallowed and glanced nervously down the street toward the railroad office, like she expected someone to appear from the shadows. That small movement stayed with him. He picked up her suitcase before she could protest. His wagon waited near the edge of town beside the water trough. The old gelding shifted impatiently as Wade secured her luggage in the back. Nora climbed into the wagon without speaking much. She sat stiffly beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. Silver Creek passed around them slowly. Lamplight glowed through the saloon windows. Someone laughed near the barber shop. A piano played badly somewhere down the street. Nora kept her eyes forward. Once they cleared town and the open valley stretched around them, Wade finally spoke. "You hungry?" "A little. There's stew back at the house." "That sounds nice." Her answer barely rose above the wind. The wagon rattled over a frozen rut. Nora caught herself against the seat, and Wade instinctively steadied her elbow before pulling his hand away again. "I'm sorry," she whispered suddenly. "For what?" "For arriving like this." Wade flicked the reins gently. "Long trip from Philadelphia." "That isn't what I meant." Silence settled again. The moon had begun climbing over the ridgeline by the time she spoke once more. "There are people looking for me back east." Wade didn't turn his head. "What kind of people?" "I don't know if it matters." "That usually means it does." Nora pressed her lips together. The wagon wheels crackled through thin frost. "I didn't lie in my letters," she said quietly. "Not exactly." The words hung between them. Wade had known enough lonely men to understand desperation, could make strangers pretend to be things they weren't. But something about her didn't feel dishonest. It felt frightened. The Harper Ranch appeared at the end of the valley nearly an hour later. Lantern light glowed from the barn. Snow rested in thin patches along the fence line. Rusty barked the moment the wagon rolled in. The old cattle dog bounded across the yard, tail wagging wildly before skidding to a stop beside Nora's boots. For the first time since arriving, her expression softened a little. "Hello there," she murmured. Rusty leaned against her leg immediately. "Well," Wade said quietly, "looks like he's decided you belong here already." Nora looked down quickly after that, as though the simple kindness nearly undid her again. Inside, the ranch house smelled faintly of cedar smoke and coffee grounds. Caleb's boots rested beside the stove, though his younger brother was nowhere in sight. Wade carried Nora's suitcase upstairs and pushed open the spare bedroom door. A quilt lay folded neatly across the bed. Beside the washbasin sat a small oil lamp and a clean towel, Mrs. Carter had insisted he buy in town. Nora stood in the doorway uncertainly. "You can lock it, if it helps you sleep," Wade said. She looked surprised. "I appreciate that." He nodded once and turned toward the stairs. Then he stopped. The hallway lamp cast soft shadows against the wooden walls between them. "Miss Bell." "Yes?" Wade rested one hand against the banister. "Out here, nobody's forcing you to smile." The wind moved softly outside the house. Nora stared at him for a long moment without speaking. Then Wade went downstairs and left her alone. Hours later, long after the fire had burned low, Nora sat on the edge of the narrow bed upstairs with both hands covering her mouth. The old ranch house creaked around her. Wind scraped branches across the roof. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she cried somewhere no one could hear her pretending not to. Before dawn, Wade woke to the sound of boots crossing the porch below his window. Then Caleb's voice drifted sharply through the frozen dark. "Wade." A pause. "You better come look at this." Outside near the north fence, wagon tracks cut deep into the snow. Fresh tracks, leading straight from Silver Creek Road toward the ranch. Caleb crouched beside the fence post with one hand resting on his knee. Frost clung to the shoulders of his wool coat. The pale morning light stretched long across the valley, turning the snow silver blue. "2 horses," he muttered. "Heavy wagon." Wade studied the marks quietly. The tracks stopped near the north ridge, overlooking the ranch house. Whoever it was had waited there. Watching, Rusty growled low in his throat beside them. "You recognize the tread?" Wade asked. Caleb shook his head once. "Not local." The cold wind moved through the pine trees behind the barn. For a moment, neither brother spoke. Then the kitchen door creaked open behind them. Nora stepped carefully onto the porch, wearing Wade's spare coat over her dress. The sleeves hung too long over her hands. Her hair had been pinned quickly, though loose strands still moved in the wind. She looked from Wade to Caleb, then down to the tracks. The color drained from her face so fast Caleb noticed immediately. "You know who made those?" he asked sharply. Nora's fingers tightened around the coat. "I don't know." "That ain't an answer, Caleb." Wade's voice stayed calm. But Caleb stood up anyway. "You bring trouble here, Miss Bell?" Nora opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence that followed felt heavier than the cold. Finally, Wade stepped toward the porch. "You eaten yet?" Nora looked startled by the question. "No." "Then come inside before coffee freezes solid." Caleb watched her carefully as she passed. Rusty followed close beside her boots. Inside, the ranch house smelled of biscuits and wood smoke. The stove crackled softly while Wade poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs chipped along the rims from years of use. Nora sat quietly near the window, both hands wrapped around the cup, though she barely drank from it. Caleb leaned against the counter. "You planning on telling us what's going on?" Wade shot him a look, but Nora answered before either man spoke again. "I told Mr. Harper there are people looking for me. That's different from people tracking you to our front gate." Her eyes lowered. I know. The old clock near the stove ticked steadily. Wade finally pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. You expecting them to come back? Nora hesitated long enough to answer the question without words. I don't know, she whispered. Caleb exhaled sharply through his nose and grabbed his coat from the wall. I'll check the upper fence line. The door shut hard behind him. Nora flinched at the sound. Wade noticed that too. After a while, he pushed the biscuit plate slightly closer to her. You should eat something. I'm sorry. You said that already. Nora stared down into her coffee. In Philadelphia, apologizing usually kept people calmer. A faint crease appeared between Wade's brows. That so? She nodded once. Outside wind rattled lightly against the windows. Wade leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully for the first time since yesterday. She looked exhausted in a way sleep alone wouldn't fix, not weak, worn down. Caleb talks rough sometimes, he said. Doesn't always mean harm by it. He has a right to ask questions. Maybe. He took a slow sip of coffee. But you got a right not to answer before you were ready. Nora looked at him then. Really looked at him. Like she was still trying to understand what kind of man sat across from her. Most men she'd known in the East filled silence quickly. They demanded explanations, judgments, defenses. Wade Harper simply waited. By midday, the sky turned heavier with clouds rolling down from the mountains. Winter came early in Idaho country. Nora insisted on helping despite Wade telling her she could rest another day. She swept the porch free of snow, organized the pantry shelves, mended a torn flour sack near the stove while Rusty slept beside her chair. Small things, quiet things. But Wade noticed she moved through the house carefully, like someone afraid to take up too much space. That afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn Carter arrived by wagon carrying jars of preserves wrapped in cloth. The older widow stepped inside without knocking, bringing cold air and the smell of pine with her. So this is the girl, she said. Nora stood quickly. Mrs. Carter looked her over once with sharp gray eyes that missed very little. Then she handed Nora a jar, blackberry preserves. Wade burns breakfast often enough to need saving. To Nora's surprise, Wade almost smiled. Mrs. Carter stayed through supper. Mostly she talked while the others listened. About snowfall. About the church roof leaking again. About Mrs. Parker's boy falling through river ice last winter. Normal things, human things. And slowly Nora's shoulders loosened. After the meal, Wade walked Mrs. Carter outside to her wagon. She's scared, the widow said quietly while tightening her gloves. I noticed, but she's trying awful hard not to show it. Snowflakes drifted softly around them now. Mrs. Carter climbed into the wagon seat. Some folks carry storms with them, Wade. Doesn't always mean they caused the weather. The wagon rolled away into the fading light. That night, the blizzard finally arrived. Wind screamed down from the mountains, hard enough to shake the walls. Snow packed against the windows. Near midnight, the lantern lamps flickered twice before the entire house fell dark. Nora woke instantly. For one terrible moment, she thought she was back on the train east of Omaha. The shouting, the footsteps, the pounding at the compartment door. She sat upright, breathing hard. Then another sound reached her through the dark. A chair creaking downstairs. The soft scrape of boots near the fireplace. Wade. Nora wrapped a blanket around herself and slowly descended the stairs. Wade sat near the fire, feeding another log into the flames. The orange light caught the rough edges of his face, while wind howled outside the cabin walls. He looked up when he heard her. Storm wake you? Nora nodded. Wade reached for the kettle hanging near the hearth. Coffee's still warm. She sat quietly across from him while he poured it into a tin cup. Neither spoke much. The fire popped softly between them. After a long while, Wade stood and draped another blanket gently across her shoulders, without saying a word. Then he returned to his chair and kept watch beside the fire until morning came. At dawn, Caleb pushed through the front door, carrying snow across the floorboards. There's something you both need to see. He dropped a leather satchel onto the table. The clasp had broken open during the storm. Inside sat several burned papers stamped with the seal of Vernon Hale Bank and Trust. And written across one half-charred document was Nora Bell's full name. The kitchen went completely still. Snow tapped softly against the windows, while Caleb spread the papers across the table beside the coffee pot. "You want to explain this now?" he asked. Nora stared at the documents like she'd seen a ghost. Wade watched the color slowly leave her face. "Where'd you find them?" she whispered. "Caught in the brush near the north ridge." Caleb folded his arms. "About 50 yards from those wagon tracks." Nora closed her eyes briefly, like she already knew what that meant. Wade pulled out a chair. "Sit down." She didn't move at first. Then slowly she lowered herself into the seat nearest the stove. Her fingers twisted tightly together in her lap beneath the table. Rusty rested his head against her boot. For a long moment nobody spoke. Finally, Wade asked the question quietly. "Who's Vernon Hale?" Nora looked toward the fire instead of at either man. "He owns the largest bank in Philadelphia." Caleb let out a dry breath. "And why's a banker sending men halfway across the country after you?" Her throat moved once before she answered. "My husband worked for him." The room stayed silent except for the wind. Wade had never heard her mention a husband before. "He was an accountant," Nora continued softly. "Careful, quiet. The kind of man who noticed numbers other people ignored." She rubbed one thumb against the silver chain at her neck. One winter he discovered land deeds disappearing from the bank records. Farmers were losing property they'd already paid for. Hale used false debts to claim their land. Caleb frowned. "And your husband tried exposing him?" Nora nodded faintly. "He kept copies, ledgers, names." Her voice thinned. "Then, one night he didn't come home." The fire cracked sharply. Wade leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" "They said it was robbery." "But you don't believe that?" "No." She finally looked up. "Because the ledgers disappeared the same night." Caleb glanced toward the burned papers. "Except they didn't." Nora swallowed. "He hid some documents before he died. He told me where to find them." Her eyes drifted toward the storm outside. "After that, men started following me, asking questions. A newspaper printed lies about me stealing from the bank. Employers stopped hiring me. Landlords refused to rent rooms." Wade said nothing, but something in his jaw tightened. "I answered your advertisement because I needed somewhere Hale wouldn't think to look," Nora admitted quietly. "A place far enough west to disappear." Caleb shook his head once in disbelief. "So this whole thing was hiding?" "No," she said immediately. "Not all of it." That answer surprised even her. The room fell quiet again. Outside, snow continued piling against the porch rails. Wade stood slowly and walked toward the window. He rested one hand against the frame while staring out toward the white valley beyond the barn. "When were you planning on telling me?" Nora lowered her eyes. "I didn't know if you'd send me away first." Wade turned then. For the first time since she arrived, there was anger in his face. Not loud anger, the kind that settled deep and stayed there. "You think that little of yourself?" Nora blinked in surprise. "That isn't. You keep talking like your trouble somebody's stuck carrying." His voice stayed calm. That almost made it worse. Caleb looked between them silently. Wade stepped closer to the table. "I asked for honesty in my letters. Didn't ask for perfection." Nora's eyes filled before she looked away quickly. "I'm trying not to ruin your life, Mr. Harper." "Wade." She shook her head faintly. "You don't understand how far men like Vernon Hale can reach." For a second, Wade simply studied her. Then he pulled his coat from the wall peg. "I understand enough. Where are you going?" "Town." Caleb straightened immediately. "I'll come." Wade nodded once. By late afternoon, the storm had eased enough for horseback travel. Silver Creek looked half buried beneath fresh snow when the Harper brothers rode in. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Horses stamped outside the saloon. The church bell rang faintly somewhere through the wind. Inside Mercer's general store, Wade picked up coffee beans, lamp oil, and shotgun shells, while Caleb quietly questioned locals near the stove. That was when the stranger walked in. Tall, dark overcoat, Eastern boots too clean for Idaho mud. He carried a folded photograph in one gloved hand. "You seen this woman?" he asked the shopkeeper. Wade froze near the counter. The shopkeeper adjusted his spectacles. "Can't say I have." The stranger unfolded the photograph anyway. Nora, younger perhaps, better dressed, but unmistakably her. "I'm collecting a debt owed to Vernon Hale," the man said calmly. Caleb's hand slowly tightened near his belt. From the back office doorway, Sheriff Doyle Mercer appeared, buttoning his coat. "Everything all right here?" The stranger nodded. "Just asking after someone." Mercer glanced once at the photograph, then very briefly at Wade. Too briefly, but long enough. Wade saw it. The sheriff already knew. That night, the ride home felt colder. By the time Wade stepped into the ranch house, Nora was standing near the stove waiting. One look at his face told her everything. "He's here," she whispered. Wade removed his gloves slowly. "Yes," Nora closed her eyes. "I'll leave in the morning." Caleb swore under his breath. But Wade only looked at her quietly across the firelight. And for the first time since she arrived at the ranch, Nora looked truly alone. The stove crackled softly between them. Caleb shifted near the doorway. "You can't seriously be thinking about leaving in this weather." "I won't bring this trouble onto your family," Nora said. Wade finally moved. He crossed the room slowly and took the coffee pot from the stove before pouring fresh coffee into her cup. His hand stayed steady. "Storm'll bury the North Road by morning," he said. "Nobody's going anywhere tonight." Nora stared down at the steam rising from the tin cup. "You don't understand what men like Hale do." Wade leaned one shoulder against the counter. "No," he said quietly, "but I understand fear well enough." The words settled heavily in the room. Caleb looked away first. Outside, the wind dragged snow against the walls, hard enough to sound like sandpaper. That night nobody slept much. Wade checked the barn twice before midnight. Caleb kept a rifle beside his chair near the window. Nora remained upstairs with the lamp burning beneath her door until nearly dawn. By morning the storm had eased into a gray silence. Snow covered the valley in smooth drifts, untouched except for the fence posts and cattle tracks near the lower pasture. Wade had just finished saddling Buck when Rusty began barking wildly near the barn. Caleb stepped outside first, then stopped cold. Smoke, dark smoke, rising behind the stable. "Wade." The brothers ran through knee-deep snow toward the rear paddock. Flames crawled along one side of the horse barn, orange against the white morning. Wade grabbed the water buckets immediately. Caleb kicked open the side gate before the horses panicked themselves bloody. Rusty barked furiously toward the tree line. That was when Wade noticed it. Tracks. Fresh boot prints leading away from the ranch, and beside them, smaller footprints. Nora's. His stomach dropped. "Nora," Caleb shouted, no answer. Wade sprinted toward the house 2 steps at a time. Upstairs, the guest room stood empty. The blanket had fallen to the floor beside the bed. One drawer hung partially open. Snow blew lightly through the cracked window above the wash basin. On the pillow sat Nora's silver necklace. Wade picked it up slowly. Then he saw the folded paper beneath it. "I'm sorry. That was all. Nothing else." Downstairs, Caleb burst through the door carrying Nora's coat. "Found this near the north fence." Wade stared toward the mountains through the frosted window. They'd taken her. He knew it immediately. Not because she ran, because she left the necklace behind. An hour later, the Harper brothers rode hard through the northern pass while snow blew sideways across the trail. The mountain road twisted through dense pine forest above frozen ravines. Wind moaned through the trees like something alive. Caleb pulled his scarf higher over his mouth. "You think Hale's men are heading for Denver? Likely. They've got a half-day lead." Wade said nothing. Buck pushed forward through deep snow, steam rolling from his nostrils. Near noon, they found the first sign. a broken wagon lantern half buried beside the trail. Then farther ahead, blood on the snow. Not much, just enough. Caleb dismounted quickly, touching the frozen stain with 2 fingers. Could be one of theirs. Wade's jaw tightened. Or Nora's. They kept riding. By dusk, the storm returned harder than before. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then through the blowing snow, Wade spotted light, faint, flickering. An abandoned trapping cabin tucked between the trees near the ridge. 2 horses stood outside. 1 guard. Wade slid quietly from the saddle. "I'll draw him wide," Caleb whispered. But Wade shook his head once. No time. Before Caleb could argue, Wade moved through the storm toward the cabin. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The guard heard it too late. A struggle. A shout swallowed by the wind. Silence again. Inside the cabin, Nora jerked upright at the sound of the door slamming open. Her wrists were tied loosely in front of her. Vernon Hale stood near the stove in a dark wool coat dusted with snow, older than she remembered. Thinner too, but the eyes remained the same, cold, careful, possessive. "You've caused me a very expensive inconvenience, Mrs. Bell." Nora's voice trembled despite herself. "My husband copied everything." Hale smiled faintly. "Yes. And where are those copies now?" Before she answered, the cabin door burst inward. Wade entered through the snowstorm, breathing hard, revolver drawn low at his side. Nora's breath caught sharply. Wade, one of Hale's men, lunged first. The fight came fast and ugly in the tight cabin space. A table overturned. The lantern shattered against the floorboards, plunging half the room into darkness. Wade took a hard blow across the shoulder but kept moving. Nora had never seen anyone stand back up that quickly after being hit. Hale backed toward the wall, panic finally cracking through his calm expression. "You have no idea who you're protecting," he snapped. Wade grabbed him by the coat front. "Seems like a woman who deserved better than what you gave her." Hale laughed bitterly through split breath. "She ruined herself long before I touched her reputation." Nora froze. The room suddenly felt smaller. "You spread those stories," she whispered. Hale looked at her without shame. "You knew too much." For a moment, nobody moved. Then outside, voices echoed through the storm. Federal marshals. Caleb burst through the doorway behind them, snow covering his coat. "Mercer's talking now," he said breathlessly. "Mrs. Carter got word to Boise yesterday." Hale's face finally changed. Not anger, fear. Wade released him slowly. Across the room, Nora stood trembling near the wall, with tears mixing into melted snow along her cheeks. Wade stepped toward her carefully. She looked at the bruise forming along his jaw, then at the blood on his sleeve. "You came after me," she whispered. Wade frowned slightly, like the answer should have been obvious. "Course I did." Outside, the storm kept roaring across the mountains. But for the first time in months, Nora Bell no longer looked like someone waiting to run. The ride back to Silver Creek took nearly half the night. Federal marshals hauled Vernon Hale and the remaining men south through the pass, while snow buried their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Caleb rode ahead with a lantern swinging from his saddle horn. Nora sat behind Wade on Buck, wrapped tightly in his heavy coat. She barely spoke. By the time the ranch finally appeared through the darkness, her hands were trembling so badly she could hardly climb down from the horse. Mrs. Carter opened the front door before they even reached the porch. "Oh, honey," the older woman breathed softly. Nora tried to answer, but the strength had already left her legs. Wade caught her before she hit the floorboards. 3 days passed in a blur of fever. Wind rattled the windows day and night while snow piled halfway up the porch rails. Mrs. Carter boiled willow bark tea in the kitchen. Caleb kept the stove fed with pine logs until the entire house smelled of smoke and cedar sap. And Wade barely left Nora's bedside. Sometimes she woke long enough to hear his boots crossing the room. Sometimes she felt the cool cloth against her forehead, or the careful way he adjusted the blankets around her shoulders. Once, sometime near dawn, She opened her eyes and found him asleep in the chair beside the bed, one hand still resting near hers like he'd fallen asleep, making sure she stayed there. The sight nearly broke her heart. By early spring, the snow finally began to melt. Water dripped steadily from the barn roof during the afternoons. Mud replaced frost along the road into Silver Creek. The valley slowly turned green again. Nora stood on the porch one morning with a shawl around her shoulders, breathing in air that no longer smelled like winter. Rusty slept near the steps in a patch of sunlight. "You're supposed to be resting." Wade's voice came from behind her. She turned slowly. "You say that every hour, because you ignore it every hour." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. Nora looked out across the pasture again, where several horses grazed near the creek. "I used to think quiet meant loneliness," she said softly. Wade leaned one shoulder against the porch post. "And now?" She listened to the wind moving through the grass. "Now I think maybe it depends who's standing beside you." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Caleb burst through the yard gate carrying lumber over one shoulder. "If you two are planning on staring at each other all morning, at least pretend you're helping me work." Nora laughed before she could stop herself. Real laughter. Wade glanced toward her at the sound like it surprised him too. Life settled slowly after that. Nora began helping Mrs. Carter twice a week at the tiny clinic near town. She organized medicine bottles, stitched torn bandages, and sat with sick children while their mothers worked. Lucy May followed her everywhere. The little orphan girl showed up outside the clinic nearly every morning, carrying crooked wildflowers or folded newspaper scraps she'd practiced reading from. One afternoon, Nora found her sitting on the boardwalk outside Harper Mercantile, sounding out words beneath her breath. "You're getting better," Nora told her. Lucy grinned proudly. "Mr. Jenkins says I read faster than Tommy Reed now." "That's because Tommy guesses half the words," the girl giggled. Across the street, Wade stood near the blacksmith, talking with Caleb. He looked over at Nora without realizing she'd caught him watching. There was something different in his expression lately. Something quieter, steadier, like he no longer expected her to disappear overnight. Weeks later, Nora returned from town to find hammering behind the ranch house. Wade stood near the back wall, wiping sawdust from his hands. "You building another shed?" she asked. "Something like that." He refused to say more. The room was finished by late April, small, warm. A window overlooking the lower pasture, where the grass moved like water when the wind came through the valley. Inside sat a writing desk beside the wall, bookshelves, a lamp, and folded neatly on the desk was a single paper. Nora picked it up slowly. A new ranch deed. Wade Harper, and beneath it, Eleanor Bell Harper. Her breath caught. Behind her, Wade removed his hat quietly. "If you stay," he said, "it should belong to you too." Outside, someone hammered fence posts in the distance. Wind brushed softly through the cottonwoods near the creek. Nora stared at the paper so long Wade finally stepped closer. "You don't gotta answer now." She looked up at him then. Really looked at him. At the bruise that had almost faded near his jaw. The lines weather and grief had left around his eyes. The man who never once asked her to become smaller so he could feel larger. Her fingers tightened slightly around the deed. "I'm tired of running," she whispered. Wade held her gaze. "Then stay." No grand speech followed, no dramatic promises, just silence. Warm and honest. That evening they sat together on the porch while the last light faded across Silver Creek Valley. Rusty slept beside Wade's boots. Somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed through the mountains for the very first time since winter. The railroad was coming west. The whole country was changing. But Nora rested her head lightly against Wade's shoulder and listened to the steady sound of his breathing beside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. And the old ranch house, once filled only with wind and lonely footsteps, no longer felt empty at all. Maybe that's the part that stays with you after a story like this. Not the snowstorm. Not the men chasing her across the mountains, not even the secrets. It's the moment someone finally looks at another broken soul and says, without saying much at all, "You can rest here," because deep down, most people know what it feels like to carry something heavy for too long. Maybe not men with rifles or bank ledgers hidden in saddlebags, but shame, grief, loneliness. The fear that if anyone ever saw the whole truth, they might walk away. And maybe that's why Wade and Nora feel real. He didn't rescue her by becoming some perfect hero. And she didn't heal because the past disappeared. They simply chose, day after day, to stop running from who they were. If you were sitting on that porch beside them, listening to the wind move through the valley while the lantern light spilled across those old wooden boards, maybe you'd realize something too. Sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it sounds like a quiet voice saying, "Then stay." If this story stayed with you, let me know where you're listening from tonight. And if you'd like, there are more old frontier stories waiting just down the trail. Stories about second chances, lost hearts, and the kind of people who still leave the light on for someone coming home through the dark.